Welcome everyone to the Great Korean Foreign Policy Debate. Tonight's program will be introduced by former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, President Emeritus at Harvard University, and Director of the Mosaver Rahmani Center for Business and Government at Harvard's Kennedy School, Lawrence Summers. Larry?
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you everyone who's joining. Harvard in general and its Kennedy School in particular pride itself on its role in engaged scholarship. Engaged scholarship means not just abstract research, as important as that can be, but detailed thought and engagement with policymakers that facilitate better decision-making in every sphere. And it's in that context that the Mosaver Rahmani Center was delighted to partner with the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation and the Korea Project at the Belfer Center to sponsor these important debates about the future of Korean national security policy. The interlocutor for our Korean friends will be our senior fellow, William Bill Overholt, who has been known to those who follow the political economy of Asia for decades, for his prescience on events relating to the rise of China, for his deep understanding of the political economy of complex transitions as societies change, for his thoughtful efforts to contemplate future scenarios, especially those where economic policy and security interact. I can think of no one better to lead the kind of discussion that we're going to have on behalf of Harvard University than our senior fellow, Bill Overholt. Bill?
Thank you very much. That's very generous. So welcome to the Great Korean Foreign Policy Debate. This is a slow motion debate spread over 3 weeks, designed to illuminate important issues rather than to elicit gotcha moments. South Korea's national security decisions are immensely consequential. Historically, when big power wars have occurred in Asia, they mostly occur over Korea. Today, along with threats to Taiwan's autonomy, North Korean nuclear weapons create the greatest current risk of a big war. Foreigners easily neglect the importance of Korea. It is Asia's pivot power. It's delicately balanced. Its economy quite dependent on China. Its security dependent on the alliance with the United States. But it's much more complicated than that even. To manage North Korea, South Korea needs support from both China and the United States. Samsung's phones sell more than Apple in the United States, and the United States is very dependent on computer chips from Samsung. Many people think of Korea as the poor cousin of Japan because it once was very poor. When I first visited South Korea in 1973, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. But now the average South Korean is a little better paid than the average Japanese. Korea's ports, airports, railroads, and universal internet connections are superior to the United States. Americans think of Japan as the big Northeast Asian ally and Korea as the small one. On the map and in population, that's true. But South Korea's military budget is about 10% larger than Japan's. Every adult male in Korea serves in the military. And that military is practiced and hardened by frequent challenges. South Korea's policies powerfully influence the risk of war over North Korea, a war that could quickly engage both China and the United States. South Korea has also become a global cultural force. In the 1970s, an evening out in Seoul usually meant hearing a Filipino band or else hearing a different Filipino band. Now, Korean classical violinists uplift musical performances all over the globe. Korean rock groups provide some of the world's coolest popular music and dance. Korean movie directors create Academy Award quality movies. Korean scientists are world leaders in developing nuclear fusion. Therefore, when we hear the views of Korean presidents, national security advisors, we're hearing things that are globally important. This race for the Korean presidency has seen polls for the major candidates bouncing around like stock market volatility. A third-party candidate is influential enough to possibly be a kingmaker this year or president 5 years hence. Tonight, we will hear from the National Security Advisor of the more conservative party, the People Power Party, whose forerunners have run Korea for much of the modern era. On February 3rd, next Thursday, US time, I'll interview the National Security Advisor to the other major candidate. And on February 10th, I'll interview the presidential candidate of the third party. Because our audience today has many languages and accents, we will provide simultaneous captioning. The caption providers are first-rate, but perfect simultaneous captioning is impossible, so we will provide a corrected version when the video is posted on YouTube later. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Kim Seung-han. He is a dean and professor of international relations at Korea University, as well as head of a prominent Institute of International Relations there. He has served as Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade and as professor at the Foreign Ministry's influential think tank. After the North Korean military attack on the South Korean naval corvette in 2010, he served as a member of the Presidential Commission for National Security Review and the Presidential Commission for Defense Reform. He holds a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Kim, welcome. It's such an honor to have you speaking with us today. Can we start with you just telling us what are the most important national security questions facing Korea? And what are the most important controversies about dealing with those questions?
Okay, thank you, Bill. First of all, I'd like to thank Harvard Kennedy School, particularly the Secretary Summers and Dr. Overholt for giving me this wonderful opportunity to speak to enlightened audience, including very distinguished scholars and experts. What was your question? The most tangible, most important issue, right? Obviously, it is North Korean nuclear issue. As you may know, North Korea, particularly during the Moon Jae-in government period, conducted one nuclear test and 36 missile tests, including the yesterday's one. By the way, Moon Jae-in government has been remarkably quiet about those provocative actions without calling them as provocations, even though those tests fires are the violation of UN Security Council resolutions. So it has provoked a lot of controversies regarding how to deal with North Korean provocations. By the way, the candidate Yoon of People Power Party strongly believes these issues should be handled by a strong determination of political leaders. At the same time, we need to combine some carrots and sticks so that North Korea may return to the negotiating table. So that's why controversies are concentrated on, for example, whether we need to lift or ease the sanctions right now before North Korea comes to the negotiating table, whether we are fully equipped with the responsive military capabilities, whether the US provided nuclear umbrella is really credible, reliable or not. So these issues are popping up everywhere, but candidate Yoon strongly believes these issues should be dealt with on the basis of ROK-US strong alliance and the extended deterrence provided by the United States should be strengthened through intensive consultations. And the UN sanctions regime should be kept on track until North Korea almost reaches the final stage of complete denuclearization. So these kind of issues are being put on the table at the moment.
Are there also important differences between the parties over the relationship with China?
Basically, China is South Korea's, officially speaking, cooperative strategic partner, while United States is our strong military ally. So there's the difference of level in terms of our relationship. But that doesn't mean ROK-US relations on the one hand and ROK-China relations on the other are in such a zero-sum relationship. That is not true. So the central axis of South Korea's national and foreign policy is ROK-US alliance relationship. But at the same time, we can maintain corporate relationship with China, mainly focusing on economy, culture, and others. But security, in terms of security relationship, the Korea must be cooperating with the United States, consulting with the United States in dealing with a variety of security challenges.
Is there some secret to managing the tension between the economic dependence on China and security relationship with the United States is there enough consensus in Korean society so that the tensions of China saying you have to side with us, and the United States saying you have to side with us, can be managed?
Well, that is not such a simple or simplifiable issue, because this is a very complicated issue. But what is really clear to me is that, and also the candidate Yoon, is that the security relationship with the United States is the most important key. Economic relations with China are also important, but one of the turning point for our strategic thinking about these challenges is intensifying US-China strategic competition. This kind of a strategic competition between those superpowers has blurred the boundary between economy and security. So the Japanese people has invented a new word of economic security. So that's why they created the ministerial kind of a position. And also they are now drafting economic security law. I think same things are taking place in Korea at the moment. So I think it is hard to say, it is clearly distinguishable between economy and security. That means we can no longer say, economic dependence on China and security dependence on the United States. Because these two kind of relations are getting more and more mixed in terms of economic security. So if you look at the statistics, Korea is trading with more than 200 entities around the world. That means Korea is having economic dependence on the whole world, not just on China. By the way, the security dependence is heavily concentrated on the United States, and also the United States recognize ROK as a very important strategic ally. So this kind of things are taking place at the moment, a very interesting way. And that's why the Conservative Party, the People Power Party, and candidate Yoon are trying to come up with kind of a new thinking in terms of economic security, in terms of hard security versus the softer security. So I think these issues are raising a lot of new kind of a homework for the new government.
Thank you. Turn to the US. Is the United States a reliable ally? We had President Trump on the verge of war, and then later saying he was in love with Kim Jong-un. We've just had a disorderly withdrawal from Afghanistan, a limp response so far to the Ukraine crisis. And the Biden administration hasn't even nominated an ambassador to Korea after more than a year. Does this raise questions about American reliability? There are voices advocating that South Korea should get nuclear weapons, that the US should station nuclear weapons in Korea, that the transfer of command from Americans to Koreans over Korean forces should be handled differently. Are those voices getting louder because of concern about American reliability?
Before I answer your question, a couple of days ago, Biden administration nominated Philip Goldberg to, Korean ambassador. Philip Goldberg is the current ambassador to Colombia, and so I need to update your statement. Whether United States is a reliable ally, I think so. But in dealing with the growing nuclear capability of North Korea, this strategic credibility issue has been emerging, particularly within the security community circle. As you know, North Korea is upgrading its nuclear missile capability, short range, mid range, long range, and even ICBM capability is within our the strategic range. So when kind of a security contingency takes place on the Korean Peninsula, for example, North Korea tries to attack South Korea with its nuclear weapons, and also North Korea threatens to attack United States mainland, New York City or Washington, D.C. with its own ICBM, then it is questionable that United States will try to provide ROK with its own nuclear umbrella. Candidate Yoon believes this kind of extended deterrence system is still reliable, but a lot of the politicians and experts are raising questions whether United States is having that amount of will to defend its own allies like ROK and Japan at the expense of the mainland security. So this is creating, nobody doubts about the United States capability, military capability, but the will is more important, whether the United States has the will to use its own military force, in this case, nuclear umbrella, to cope with the North Korea's growing nuclear threat. So this issue should be handled very closely and intensely between ROK and the United States. That's why candidate Yoon has been emphasizing the need to strengthen extended deterrence. Okay. Now, there are a couple of consultation mechanisms, but during the Moon period, these consultation mechanisms for extended deterrence have not been being operated quite smoothly. So we need to upgrade and institutionalize those mechanisms so that South Korean people may continue to trust the United States in terms of extended deterrence and the workable military alliance between ROK and the United States.
Are there big differences between the two candidates on that subject?
Not very much, but candidate Lee says the nuclear umbrella has no problem at all. but candidate Yoon leaves some space for improvement, even though we continue to support extended deterrence. But during the Moon Jae-in government period, these mechanisms for extended deterrence have been kind of a declining due to the lack of trust, and also Moon Jae-in government being preoccupied with its own kind of appeasement policy vis-a-vis North Korea. So this is right timing for us to revisit our kind of a deterrent system. And if possible, we need to strengthen this mechanism so that North Korea may not misunderstand our messages as well as our determination.
Thank you. Another question about the U.S. President Biden is promoting an alliance of democracies and a stance of ideological confrontation with China. South Korea and America share a devotion to democracy, but Korea's history is complicated. Park Chung-hee's dictatorship saved South Korea from what was then a militarily and economically superior North Korea. Then democracy was built by others on that educated middle-class society that President Park created. Taiwan and Singapore had similar experiences. Should South Korea join the US in firmly promoting democracy for every country at every level of development, or does Korea see a need for a more complex approach?
That's a very good question. Well, first of all, I'd like to say South Korea is the most successful kind of a case of the US alliance policy since the end of World War II. If you look around, maybe Korea is almost a single country who has accomplished economic development and a political democratization. So this is kind of a role model for the US policy of alliance, particularly democracy. Okay, ROC-US alliance is based upon shared values as well as shared strategic interests. Values are important because we can share the similar kind of a worldview and vision. By the way, I would say it is hypocritical to say universal values or human rights without talking about North Korean human rights from the South Korean point of view. For the past, several years, Korean government has been extremely quiet about that particular issue of North Korean human rights. So that's why I think if candidate Yoon is elected, this kind of a value-oriented kind of policy is going to be emphasized, even though we will try to be a realist, meaning kind of a national interest should be located at the very center. But at the same time, if possible, we will be making effort to promote democracies around the world. At least we won't turn a blind eye to other cases of human rights violations around the world. This is going to be more effective if we work together, meaning ROK and the United States. So probably Korea is not going to be actively promoting democracies around the world, because Korea is not having that kind of capability or capacity like the United States. But we can support diplomatically the US effort, and also Korea wouldn't hesitate to join kind of a multilateral kind of effort to promote democracies or to criticize human rights violations, in the world. So that is our position.
Very, very clear statement. Thank you. You mentioned North Korea. Many years of tough sanctions on North Korea have not stopped its nuclear weapons program. Historic symmetry under President Trump, who went so far as to say that he was in love with Kim Jong-un, has not stopped it. Now North Korea is testing extraordinarily improved missiles, as you mentioned. This is contrary to UN resolutions. Is a new crisis inevitable? Alternatively, is North Korea's nuclear status becoming normalized? Is there some new combination of incentives and sanctions that might moderate or eliminate North Korea's nuclear weapons?
Well, I think North Korea appears to be sending a signal to the United States clearly that it will continue provocations unless United States recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. Period. That means lifting of sanctions and the resumption of kind of a dialogue, not for denuclearization, but for nuclear arms control and diplomatic normalization between Pyongyang and Washington. As you may agree, the sanctions regime led by the UN Security Council is giving a slow but the meaningful damage to North Korean regime in the sense that they are prohibited from exporting minerals and marine products, particularly to China. And also they have got ceilings in terms of the oil import, etc., etc. These kind of sanctions have been, passed, drafted, since 2017 when North Korea concentrated its provocations, including nuclear test. So I think if a candidate Yoon is elected, the new government, he actually pointed out clearly, he will suggest a kind of a roadmap for denuclearization of North Korea. Maybe not a very detailed roadmap, but so that North Korea may expect what we are trying to do. We are going to suggest a kind of a roadmap for denuclearization. Maybe this roadmap may include possible stages and possible incentives. But clearly he said sanctions regime will remain intact until North Korea reaches the final destination of complete denuclearization. If North Korea makes a real progress, meaningful progress, we may think of economic assistance rather than easing or lifting sanctions. So this kind of predictable kind of a roadmap will be suggested. And then, if possible, we can negotiate with Pyongyang for meaningful progress. So this is what we are roughly thinking of at this moment, but detailed things are not to be disclosed, if I may.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, that is, yeah.
You're looking at incremental progress
Yes,
to be complemented by incremental assistance,
incentives, yeah.
which is an important diversion from what has sometimes been the American position, that they have to totally commit to total elimination of their nuclear weapons before and effectively finish the job before they get much benefit on the other side. It seems like a new and possibly more credible roadmap.
I think the Singapore and Hanoi, particularly Hanoi summit between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, demonstrated clearly so-called top-down kind of a grand bargain type approach is not workable, realistically speaking. We are now all sitting on the chair at the moment. If we try to walk, we need to stand up first, right? So likewise, we need to kind of come up with some working level coordination so that we may rely on kind of summit level conversion, kind of agreement. That's why if we are able to strike a kind of a grand bargain, that will be much better. But realistically, we need to coordinate, and also we need to consult with each other. We need to negotiate what is possible, what will not be possible. So incremental approach will be unavoidable. But as I already pointed out, and candidate Yoon pointed out repeatedly, the current sanctions regime, okay, is rather effective regime as compared with the previous one. The turning point was 2017. That's why in Hanoi, Chairman Kim Jong-un heavily concentrated on the lifting of key 5 sanctions resolution of the UN Security Council, right? So this is almost a single remaining leverage we are possessing for the sake of inducing North Korea to the final stage of denuclearization. Otherwise, candidate Lee of the governing party is talking about a snapback approach. Once we lift sanctions, and then we can resume those sanctions when North Korea betrays our, trust. I don't think it is workable. That, in light of current U.S.-China and U.S.-Russian relationship, that means China and or Russia would not agree on the resumption of kind of sanctions on North Korea. So that's why we got to be realistic, but at the same time, we got to be flexible. Flexible in the sense that we can provide economic assistance when North Korea shows a real progress, meaningful progress. But we are going to stay on sanctions regime until North Korea totally eliminates its nuclear weapons. We got to be realistic in the sense that this is not going to take place overnight in such a short period of time. That's why working level kind of negotiations will be put in the front runner so that we can expect some real progress at the summit level later kind of a stage.
I'd like to go back to an earlier comment that there are voices calling for South Korea to get its own nuclear weapons and voices calling for the US to conspicuously station nuclear weapons in South Korea. Is that an area of controversy between the candidates in this election?
I don't think so. There's a big difference because candidate Lee opposes South Korea's nuclear armament and even deployment of tactical nuclear weapons back to South Korea. Candidate Yoon is having the same position. But as I already pointed out, nuclear umbrella and extended deterrence. Precisely speaking, nuclear umbrella is different from extended deterrence because extended deterrence consists of 3 elements: nuclear umbrella, missile defense, and the conventional military capability. So we need to review whether these 3 elements of extended deterrence remain strong and credible. If we find some problems, some space for improvement, we have to do it. Candidate Lee doesn't show very much of a commitment toward those issues, how to strengthen our combined the posture in terms of dealing with the North Korean nuclear threat. So I think the very kind of passionate, if I may, Plan B is not being shared by those 2 candidates, even though a lot of Korean people support nuclear armament or redeploying of US tactical nuclear back to South Korea on the opinion survey. That is, you know, very distant kind of a symptom, even though those 2 candidates are being criticized for being somewhat, you know, populist or populistic. But on this particular issue, they are maintaining a very calm and realistic, you know, position.
Thank you. I mean, that leads me to question, how do you and the candidate see North Korea? In the West, many people see it as a fearsome tiger. Several years ago, there was some very senior people in Washington were portraying North Korea's acquisition of nuclear weapons as part of a grand strategy to take over South Korea. Other people see North Korea as a nearly helpless mouse. Its economy is 2% the size of South Korea. It has no real friends. Even China isn't a real friend. it has a conventional military that's pretty hopeless despite large numbers. In that view, Pyongyang depends on nuclear weapons because it doesn't have anything else. Is this a mouse with a giant tiger head? How should we think about it? These images often drive policy, especially popular sentiment.
Is this still alive? Mouse with a giant tiger head. that is not such a viable kind of a combination. But I think I like your metaphor because it describes the current situation of North Korea. North Korea is having such a small, weak economy, but North Korean leader and leadership is pouring in the military development, particularly the nuclear development, at the expense of the decent life of the North Korean people. This is absolutely abnormal situation. We often talk about German case and also the West Germany's so-called Ostpolitik vis-a-vis East Germany. But if you compare East Germany and North Korea, East Germany, if I oversimplify, this is clearly the fact, did not challenge the global kind of norms, right? Like NPT. So in that sense, North Korea is quite different from East Germany. By the way, former President Kim Dae-jung implemented so-called the Sunshine Policy to North Korea from 1998 to 2002. Interestingly, during that period, we didn't have very volatile North Korean nuclear controversies or provocations. North Korea was remarkably quiet, appeared to be very cooperative. But at the end of the day, we realized North Korea was, conducting kind of a very secret, another type of nuclear development, HEU, highly enriched uranium program, which was disclosed in the year of 2002. So that period was the period when Sunshine Policy was relatively workable, even though it didn't come up with a dramatic success. Now, North Korea's, what did you say? The big giant, tiger head. That is a really weird kind of situation, meaning that North Korea has become an entity in which its own regime security is located higher than national security. Why North Korea is developing nuclear weapons? I think that this is for the sake of preserving the Kim dynasty. So this is for the sake of regime security. Nuclear weapons are really needed for the protection of North Korean people's, the lives and assets. Probably not. Certainly not. So I think that's why I think we need to make a North Korean regime realize that their nuclear weapons development is not quite helpful. for regime security. If you continue to possess nuclear weapons, that is certainly detrimental to your regime security. That's why we impose sanctions on North Korea, right? Of course, North Korean people are suffering from kind of a collateral damage of those sanctions, but we need to focus on North Korean regime, particularly the North Korean leader, so that he is the only person who can make a strategic decision. Otherwise, we are very likely to repeat our past kind of mistakes for the past, 30 years. That's why candidate Yoon, even though he's very open-minded and flexible whenever necessary, but a sanctions regime should remain intact. When there is a progress, we can provide decent amount of economic assistance, and also humanitarian assistance will be provided regardless of the political situation between the two Koreas, even before the real progress of denuclearization. But sanctions regime. Actually, the Chairman Kim revealed his real kind of a mind in Hanoi. Actually, the American negotiating team, and including President Trump, were ready to talk about other issues, but Chairman Kim tried to concentrate on sanctions lifting. That demonstrates sanctions are effective, and that is kind of a fatal spot of the North Korean regime. That's why we need to think of our future strategy from that particular angle. Otherwise, candidate Yoon believes we are very likely to repeat our past mistakes.
Thank you. You mentioned East Germany. In West Germany, when the country was still divided, conservatives and progressives agreed to jointly pursue a long-range policy of Ostpolitik toward East Germany, a policy of change through rapprochement. No matter which party held the chancellorship in West Germany, and no matter what negative thing East Germany might have done, they had the same policy. When the crisis came in East Germany, West Germany was perceived well in the East, and the East decided to be united with the West. Is there any chance that the parties in South Korea could create a South-South common policy toward North Korea that can withstand elections every 5 years and be a foundation for all South Korean initiatives toward North Korea?
Yeah. I hope we will be able to come up with a bipartisan policy toward North Korea, but realistically, it is very hard to expect that kind of consensus by 100%. Of course, so we can share some parts of the grand policy toward North Korea. In terms of a priority, I think the governing party and candidate Lee is focusing on kind of a declaratory peace, not real peace. So that's why President Moon and also candidate Lee are talking about end of war declaration. even though North Korea keeps developing its nuclear weapons without, stopping its operation of nuclear programs. East Germany case, as I already mentioned, East Germany, in retrospect, was a very kind of a docile regime in the and a localized regime, local-minded, in the sense that they didn't try to challenge the hegemonic powers like the United States or even Soviet Union. They were kind of a satellite state of Soviet Union, and they have a very narrow kind of a worldview. That's why West Germany had some space for infiltrating West German culture and also some capitalist elements into East Germany. But North Korea is such an isolated country. And one of the starkest differences that North Korea is a gambler in the sense that they, decided to challenge the US-led NPT regime. The intention or motivation was interesting, to exchange nuclear weapons with the US recognition of North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. In other words, if United States recognized North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, then North Korea is willing to do anything for the United States, which is unacceptable to the US. If North Korea is treated as an exceptional case, NPT regime itself is likely to collapse. So this kind of a stark difference is making us to come up with a bipartisan policy. Progressives believe still there are some space for inducing North Korea to do something for us conservatives. Well, the primary condition for a rapprochement is to talk about denuclearization. So peace versus denuclearization. Actually, denuclearization is the sufficient condition for real peace. But peace does not guarantee denuclearization because we have seen so many betrayal of trust on the part of North Korea for the past 30 years. So that's why we still are struggling with so many differences.
Thank you. That makes it very clear. Let me come back to China. Today's greatest danger to Asian peace might be US-China tensions over Taiwan, possibly even more dangerous than the North Korean nuclear issues. How should South Korea deal with these tensions over Taiwan? In the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, the US may want to deploy some of its troops based in Korea to support Taiwan. How should South Korea react to that issue?
Well, you mean the the military crisis in Taiwan, right? In the Taiwan Strait.
Yes. First, a crisis without war, and second, if China attacks and the U.S. says, well, we have all these troops in South Korea, we want to redeploy a bunch of them to war in the Taiwan Strait. That presumably creates some risks for South Korea. How do you manage that?
Right, right. But if China attacks Taiwan, South Korean government will pay more attention to North Korea, whether North Korea almost simultaneously makes provocations against us. Because that could be a brilliant opportunity for North Korea to take advantage of the Taiwan crisis, the military contingency. As you may know, when there's a Taiwan contingency, the first entity to respond to that kind of situation is the U.S. forces in Japan, not in Korea, USFJ. So I think USFJ will try to deal with that contingency in Taiwan. If things are not stabilized, then United States will be thinking of USFK, US forces in Korea. But as you may know, USFK consists of mainly infantry forces and Air Force. Infantry in the Army is not for amphibious operations, right? But USFJ, they are different in terms of military posture. So if United States try to ask something to USFK, that is likely to be an Air Force rather than infantry force. But as I already mentioned, if North Korea provokes again and things are complicated, United States wouldn't try to draw some forces from USFK because the Korean Peninsula itself is also critically important. So our homework in that sense is that how we can deal with those two contingencies almost at the same time. Otherwise, these two contingencies are likely to be escalated into a kind of a major war in Northeast Asia. So I think this is a very important issue that should be consulted between ROK and the United States very quietly, not openly. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to another geographic direction. For years, alliance unity in dealing with China has been disrupted by tensions over history between South Korea and Japan. Of course, there are also same issues between North Korea and Japan. Recently, there's been some progress on military cooperation. Is there a path to finally resolve these tensions, or at least get them to the point where they don't interfere with alliance cooperation?
Korea-Japan relations are facing the worst moment in history, I would say. Okay, comfort women issue, enforced labor issue, export control issue, GSOMIA issue. All of these issues are yet to be resolved. That's why candidate Yoon is very much concerned about this deteriorating Korea-Japan, Japan-Korea relations. If he's elected, he said he will try to strike a kind of a grand bargain with Japan, meaning that we will put all of these issues on the table and try to come up with kind of a comprehensive solution. If we try to deal with these issues one by one, that is going to be endless, kind of a waste of time. So kind of a comprehensive deal is necessary. But it takes two to dance a tango, right? Or to clap hands, right? So Japanese need to show a very flexible, open-minded kind of attitude, like South Korea will. Then we can expect good kind of result. So this is what he tries to do when he takes the responsibility for the new government. Why? Because Korea-Japan relationship is critically important for the sake of three parties' national interests. The previous government often believed that Korea-U.S. alliance remains, okay. It's going to be all, right, even though we are having tensions with Japan. But United States kind of a mindset is quite different. As long as Korea-Japan, Japan-Korea relations remain, very, bad, Korea-U.S. or Japan-U.S. relations are not sufficient, because the United States believes kind of a trilateral kind of a coordination and cooperation is critically important. Otherwise, North Korea tries to drive a wedge, and China will be tempted to drive a wedge between, Korea and the United States by taking advantage of Korea-Japan tensions. So this is a very important variable we need to resolve if three of us will try to come up with really synergistic effect among our three parties in the coming years.
Thank you. In many ways, the biggest issue that Japan confronts in dealing with Korea is, and this is the same for China, do they really want a peaceful or cooperative Korean peninsula? Or would they see that as a threat? Does China want China doesn't want a war. They're very concerned about stability in that sense. Do these two big powers really want to see some kind of rapprochement, some kind of settlement that would presumably be part of the aftermath of dealing with the nuclear weapons program, or is it in their interest to keep Korea divided, not so powerful?
Well, I think China and Japan support peaceful Korean Peninsula and even peaceful unification of Korea, if possible. But the problem is North Korea, because North Korea is, betraying our expectation by challenging the NPT regime, by resisting international kind of demands. Otherwise, there would be no reason to oppose Korean peaceful unification from the Chinese and Japanese point of view. Of course, some ideological right in Japan may be tempted to take advantage of the threatening North Korea in order to rationalize their platforms, like the military buildup or the hatred over South Korea, etc., etc. But decent the population of those two countries, including Japan and China, do not oppose, do not have any reason to oppose peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. For example, China, to deal with the North Korean problem, they have been sacrificing a lot of issues related to the United States, creating a lot of misunderstandings on the part of the United States. Of course, China is trying to link a North Korean issue to US-China relationship, and also China is looking at North Korea through the lens of US-China strategic competition. But because of North Korea, China is receiving a kind of unnecessary pressure from the United States, which is producing kind of a negative synergistic effect between China and the United States, like a trade war, etc., etc., and the Taiwan issue. China is trying to link every other issue to this particular issue. So things are getting more and more complicated. But if the North Korean issue is resolved and peaceful unification takes place on the Korean Peninsula, I think economy first kind of environment will come in Northeast Asia. China is likely to be the champion or leader of North Korean economic integration. So in that sense, China has no reason to oppose peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. Japan is in the same position, I guess.
Thank you very much. Well, we've covered a lot of territory. Do you have some final thoughts that you'd like to leave with our viewers? Would you like to summarize your party's national security strategy?
Well, candidate Yoon believes ROC-US alliance should be kind of reconstructed to the extent that we can deal with a variety of threats and challenges together more effectively. Candidate Yoon opposes strategic ambiguity in coping with the strategic competition between US and China. So the central axis of South Korea's security policy is based on ROC-US alliance. Again, a ROC-US alliance will be playing as the central axis of South Korea's foreign and security policy when candidate Yoon is elected next month. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Your presentation is a presentation both of a scholar and a man of action. And we're very grateful for the time you've taken to clarify so many issues.
Thank
Again,
you for inviting me to this wonderful event. Thank you. Thank you.